I'm Lois Canup, 47 years old, and I spent 15 years building groundbreaking cancer research that could save thousands of lives, only to watch my own CEO steal credit and try to destroy my career when I fought back. But what he did to cover it up was even worse. If you've ever been undermined at work or had your life's work stolen by someone in power, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this kind of professional betrayal. I never planned to become a biotech researcher. Growing up in a small town in Oregon, I was the daughter of a high school chemistry teacher and a nurse, and science felt like the family business. But it wasn't until my grandmother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer when I was 22 that I understood what I wanted to do with my life. I watched this brilliant woman, who had taught me to garden and cook and think critically about everything, waste away in a hospital bed while doctors apologized for not having better treatment options. She held my hand 3 days before she died and said, "Lois, promise me you'll do something that matters." I graduated with my PhD in molecular biology from OHSU 4 years later, and every day in the lab since then has been about keeping that promise. My first real break came when I was 28, working as a postdoc at a small biotech startup called Meridian Therapeutics in Portland. The company was developing targeted therapies for rare cancers, and my supervisor, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, was the kind of mentor every young scientist dreams of. She was demanding but fair, brilliant but humble, and she had this way of seeing potential in data that others missed. I'll never forget the day she called me into her office, which smelled permanently of coffee and had research papers stacked so high they threatened to topple over. "Lois," she said, looking up from a gel image I'd given her that morning, "this protein interaction you've identified, this could be the key we've been looking for." She was right. That discovery became the foundation for Meridian's first FDA-approved drug, and more importantly, it taught me how to see the forest through the trees in research. Dr. Martinez fought to get my name on the patent, something that didn't always happen for postdocs, and she made sure I understood that good science is only as valuable as your ability to protect and communicate it. The next decade was everything I'd dreamed of when I'd sat by my grandmother's bedside. I moved through roles at increasingly prestigious companies, each position building on the last. I spent 3 years at Genentech working on monoclonal antibodies, where I learned the intricacies of large-scale drug development and the brutal efficiency required to bring treatments from bench to bedside. Then 2 years at a startup in Seattle focused on immunotherapy, where I honed my skills in running lean, high-impact research teams. I published 12 papers in top-tier journals, spoke at conferences across the country, and started to build a reputation as someone who could identify promising targets that others overlooked. The work was challenging, sometimes frustrating, often heartbreaking when promising compounds failed in clinical trials, but it felt meaningful in a way that made the long hours and constant pressure worth it. I was building something that mattered, following pathways that could lead to treatments for diseases that had no good options. My golden period started when I joined Castellan Pharmaceuticals 5 years ago as senior research director. Castellan was a mid-sized company based in San Diego, big enough to have substantial resources but small enough that individual researchers could still make a real impact. The CEO, Stephen Webb, had recruited me personally after hearing me speak at a conference about novel approaches to drug-resistant cancers. He was charming, articulate, and seemed genuinely passionate about the science. "Lois," he'd said over dinner after my presentation, "we need someone who thinks differently about cancer research, someone who isn't afraid to pursue unconventional targets." The offer was generous, the research budget was substantial, and most importantly, I'd have the autonomy to pursue the kind of high-risk, high-reward projects that larger companies often avoided. I felt like I'd finally found a place where I could do my best work. Those first 4 years at Castellan were everything I'd hoped for. I built a team of 8 brilliant researchers, secured millions in grant funding, and established collaborations with academic medical centers across the country. We published our work in Nature, Science, and Cell, and I was invited to join editorial boards and grant review panels. The company promoted me twice, and I was earning more money than I'd ever imagined when I'd started graduate school. More importantly, we were making real progress on developing treatments for pancreatic cancer, one of the most devastating and treatment-resistant cancers. My team had identified a novel target protein that seemed to be critical for tumor survival, and our preliminary compounds were showing remarkable efficacy in animal models. For the first time in my career, I felt like we might actually be on the verge of a breakthrough that could help patients like my grandmother. But even during those successful years, there were signs that I should have paid more attention to. Stephen had a way of taking credit for successes that felt subtle but consistent. In board meetings, research updates that I'd prepared became our strategy and his vision. When we published papers, he insisted on being listed as senior author even when his contribution was minimal. There was also his treatment of other senior staff, particularly women. Linda Zhao, our head of clinical development, had left abruptly 2 years ago after what HR described as philosophical differences about research priorities. I'd heard rumors that she'd clashed with Stephen over a clinical trial design, but he'd painted her departure as a mutual decision focused on cultural fit. At the time, I dismissed it as typical corporate politics. Linda was known for being uncompromising, and sometimes brilliant people just didn't work well together. I was too focused on my research to look deeper into what had really happened. The catalyst that changed everything started on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning in March. I arrived at the lab around 7:30, which was typical for me, and found my research associate Kevin Park already at his bench preparing cell cultures for our latest round of compound testing. The lab was quiet, except for the hum of incubators and the occasional beep of monitoring equipment, and sunlight was streaming through the large windows that overlooked the company's carefully landscaped courtyard. I loved these early morning hours, when the science felt pure and unencumbered by meetings and administrative demands. Kevin looked up when I entered and smiled. "The new batch is looking really promising, Dr. Canup. The cells are responding even better than last week." That morning's work was focused on refining our lead compound, which we'd codenamed PC47 for pancreatic cancer target 47. After 3 years of methodical development, we'd created a small molecule that seemed to selectively target our protein of interest while leaving healthy cells largely unaffected. The data we'd been generating over the past 6 months was extraordinary, the kind of results that make researchers double and triple check their methods because they seem too good to be true. But every experiment confirmed what we were seeing. PC47 was shrinking tumors in mice by an average of 73% with minimal side effects. If these results held up in human trials, we could be looking at a game-changing treatment for one of medicine's most challenging cancers. Around 10 o'clock, I was analyzing flow cytometry data when my assistant Maria Santos knocked on my office door. Maria had been with Castellan for 8 years and had a sixth sense for corporate politics that I'd learned to trust. "Dr. Canup," she said, closing the door behind her, "Stephen wants to see you in his office at 11. He said to bring all your current PC47 data." There was something in her tone that made me look up from my computer screen. "Did he say what it was about?" I asked. Maria shook her head, but her expression was troubled. "He seemed different today, more formal than usual, and he had James Morrison with him." James Morrison was our Chief Business Development Officer, a man whose presence in research discussions usually meant that promising work was being evaluated for partnership deals or licensing agreements. As I gathered my files and prepared for the meeting, I felt a familiar flutter of excitement. Maybe Stephen wanted to discuss accelerating our timeline for clinical trials, or perhaps he'd identified a potential pharmaceutical partner interested in our work. I'd been pushing for months to move PC47 into human testing, arguing that our preclinical data was strong enough to justify an investigational new drug application with the FDA.
The meeting could be the green light I'd been hoping for.
I spent the next 20 minutes reviewing my presentation slides and organizing the most recent experimental data. The numbers were extraordinary: tumor reduction, biomarker analysis, toxicity profiles, and pharmacokinetic data that painted a picture of a compound with real therapeutic potential. As I walked down the hallway toward Stephen's corner office, past the company's wall of framed patents and photos from various research conferences, I felt proud of what my team had accomplished. We'd taken a theoretical target and developed it into something that could genuinely help patients. This was why I'd become a scientist. Stephen's office was a study in corporate success: floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive furniture, and carefully curated artifacts that suggested both scientific credibility and business acumen. A signed photo of him with the former FDA commissioner sat prominently on his desk, next to a Crystal Award from the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. When I entered, Stephen was sitting behind his desk with James Morrison beside him, both men wearing expressions that seemed oddly formal for what I'd expected to be a research discussion. "Lois," Stephen said, standing and gesturing toward the chair across from his desk, "thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." What happened next would change everything about my career and my understanding of the company I'd devoted 5 years of my life to. Stephen opened the conversation by praising the quality of my team's work on PC47, acknowledging that the data was exceptional and potentially transformative. But then his tone shifted in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "However," he continued, "we've decided that the project needs to be restructured to ensure optimal development and commercialization potential." The restructuring, as Stephen explained it, involved transferring primary leadership of PC-47 from my research division to a new integrated development team that would be headed by Dr. Richard Brennan, who had joined Castellan just 6 months earlier as Vice President of Translational Research. According to Stephen, this change would streamline decision-making and leverage Richard's extensive experience with clinical development. My role would be to provide scientific support and institutional knowledge to Richard's team while transitioning to focus on new target identification and early-stage research. I sat in stunned silence as Stephen outlined how my life's work was being reassigned to someone who had contributed nothing to its development. Richard Brennan was competent but uninspiring, a corporate scientist who'd spent his career managing other people's discoveries rather than making his own. The idea that he could more effectively develop PC-47 than the team that had created it was absurd, but I could see from Stephen's demeanor that this decision was final, not a discussion. I don't understand, I finally managed to say, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. My team developed this compound from the ground up. We know every aspect of its mechanism of action. We've optimized the synthesis. We've characterized its activity profile. Why would you hand that institutional knowledge to someone who's never worked with these targets? Stephen exchanged a glance with James Morrison before responding. Lois, your contributions have been invaluable, and you'll be fully credited for the foundational work. But Richard has the clinical development experience and industry relationships necessary to move this forward efficiently. This isn't about the quality of your science. It's about positioning Castellan for optimal commercial success. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with Stephen and James explaining the strategic rationale for the reorganization and assuring me that my career trajectory at Castellan remained extremely positive. They talked about new research budgets for my team, exciting opportunities to explore next-generation targets, and the importance of my ongoing contribution to the company's scientific excellence. But all I could think about was the 3 years of methodical work, the late nights troubleshooting experiments, the careful optimization that had turned a theoretical concept into a potential medicine, and how it was all being handed to someone else because he had better industry relationships. As I walked back to my lab after the meeting, I felt numb. My team was scattered across various experiments, and I realized I had no idea how to explain what had just happened. Kevin looked up from his microscope as I entered, his expression immediately shifting to concern when he saw my face. Dr. Canup, is everything okay? I forced a smile and nodded, but I knew that nothing was okay, and I had no idea how to make it right. That evening, I called Dr. Rebecca Martinez, my former mentor who now ran her own consulting firm. After I explained what had happened, there was a long pause before she spoke. Lois, she said finally, this sounds like they're preparing to take credit for your work. Have you documented everything? Patents, invention records, research notebooks? I assured her that I had, but her next words chilled me. Good, because if I know anything about corporate politics, this is just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, the systematic dismantling of my role became clear. Richard Brennan scheduled meetings with my team members to understand the current research status and optimize research workflows. Key experiments were reassigned to researchers in his division, and I was gradually excluded from strategic planning discussions about PC-47's development timeline. The compound that I'd named, developed, and shepherded through 3 years of preclinical testing was becoming someone else's project, and I was being positioned as a supporting player in my own discovery. The breaking point came during a company-wide research meeting where Richard presented his team's progress on PC-47. Standing in front of the entire research division, he outlined the compound's development history, its mechanism of action, and its potential clinical applications, speaking as if he'd been involved from the beginning. When he clicked to a slide showing our most recent efficacy data, he referred to it as the results we've achieved and outlined our strategy for moving forward. I sat in the back of the conference room, watching my colleagues nod appreciatively at Richard's presentation of work that my team had produced, and I realized that I was witnessing the systematic erasure of my contribution to what could be the most important discovery of my career. After the meeting, I requested a follow-up discussion with Stephen about my concerns regarding the presentation and the ongoing transfer of responsibilities. His response was swift and dismissive. Liz, I think you're overreacting to normal corporate restructuring. Richard acknowledged the foundational work done by previous teams. No one is trying to diminish your contributions. But when I pointed out that my name hadn't appeared anywhere in Richard's presentation, and that he'd consistently referred to the work as his team's accomplishments, Stephen's demeanor hardened. I think you need to focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on recognition issues. We have exciting new projects that need your attention. That night, I began documenting everything. I made copies of research notebooks, patent applications, email correspondence, and experimental data. I reviewed my employment contract and intellectual property agreements, and I started keeping detailed records of every interaction related to PC 47. Dr. Martinez had been right. This was just the beginning, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. The retaliation started subtly, in ways that would be difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. My access to certain research databases was mysteriously revoked due to system updates. Meetings I'd historically been included in were suddenly scheduled without my knowledge. Budget requests for my team's ongoing research were subjected to additional review processes that delayed approvals for weeks. When I raised these issues with Stephen, he assured me they were temporary administrative adjustments related to the research reorganization, but the pattern was clear. I was being systematically marginalized. 3 weeks after the initial meeting about PC 47, I requested a formal discussion with Human Resources about my concerns regarding the transfer of my research responsibilities and the subsequent changes to my role. Castellan's HR director, Jennifer Walsh, was a polished professional who joined the company 2 years earlier from a large pharmaceutical corporation. Her office was decorated with motivational posters about teamwork and innovation, and she listened to my concerns with practiced empathy before explaining that organizational restructuring sometimes creates temporary discomfort for team members who are adjusting to new roles. When I provided specific examples of how my contributions to PC 47 were being minimized and my current responsibilities were being restricted, Jennifer took careful notes and assured me that she would investigate these concerns thoroughly. She explained that Castellan was committed to maintaining a positive work environment for all employees, and that my valuable contributions were recognized and appreciated. However, she also noted that adaptation to organizational changes was an important part of professional growth and suggested that I might benefit from focusing on the exciting new opportunities available in my revised role. The investigation Jennifer promised consisted of brief conversations with Stephen and Richard, both of whom apparently confirmed that the reorganization was proceeding as planned and that I was being provided with appropriate new research responsibilities. When Jennifer reported back to me 2 weeks later, she explained that she'd found no evidence of inappropriate treatment or recognition issues. The transfer of PC 47 was described as a strategic business decision based on development expertise, and the changes to my access and responsibilities were characterized as normal adjustments during organizational transitions. But Jennifer's most troubling comment came at the end of our follow-up meeting. She noted that several colleagues had mentioned I seemed resistant to change and focused on past projects rather than future opportunities. When I asked who had made these comments, she declined to provide specifics, citing confidentiality policies. However, she suggested that I consider whether my approach to the transition might be contributing to some of the challenges I was experiencing. I left that meeting with a clear understanding that Castellan's HR department was not going to advocate for me or investigate my concerns in any meaningful way. Jennifer's investigation had been perfunctory, designed more to create documentation of company responsiveness than to address actual problems. More concerning, it seemed that my legitimate questions about the handling of my research were being reframed as attitude problems and resistance to corporate change.
Oude.
That evening, I contacted an employment attorney recommended by Dr. Martinez. After reviewing my documentation and listening to my account of recent events, the lawyer, Patricia Hoffman, was direct in her assessment. You're being pushed out, and they're doing it carefully to avoid legal liability. The question is whether you want to fight this or start looking for other opportunities. When I asked about the strength of my position, she explained that intellectual property disputes in corporate research were notoriously difficult to prove, especially when the company controlled most of the documentation and witnesses. Your best protection, she said, is creating a clear record of what happens next and being prepared for this to get worse before it gets better. The escalation came faster than I expected. 2 days after my meeting with Patricia, Stephen called me into his office for what he described as a performance discussion. This time, he was accompanied by Jennifer Walsh, who carried a thick folder that I suspected contained the documentation for whatever they had planned. The meeting began with Stephen expressing concern about my recent performance and attitude, citing feedback from colleagues who felt I was struggling with the transition to new research responsibilities. Stephen outlined several specific concerns: missed deadlines on research reports that I had never been asked to prepare, inadequate collaboration with Richard's team on projects I'd been excluded from, and a negative attitude toward organizational changes that was reportedly affecting team morale. Each accusation was carefully phrased and impossible to directly refute without sounding defensive or argumentative. When I attempted to explain that I hadn't been informed about the deadlines he mentioned, Stephen suggested that communication issues might be contributing to the performance problems. The most damaging accusation came when Stephen claimed that several team members had expressed concerns about my possessiveness regarding past research projects and my resistance to knowledge transfer. He specifically mentioned that Kevin Park, my research associate, had reported feeling pressured to withhold information from Richard's team about PC-47 development methods. This was a complete fabrication, as I had explicitly encouraged Kevin and other team members to fully cooperate with the transition, but Stephen presented it as evidence of my unprofessional behavior. Jennifer Walsh took over at this point, explaining that Castellan was implementing a performance improvement plan designed to help me address these concerns and succeed in my current role. The plan included weekly progress meetings with Stephen, detailed reporting requirements for all research activities, and mandatory participation in a leadership development program focused on change management and collaborative leadership. She presented this as supportive intervention, but the implication was clear. I was being put on notice that my job was in jeopardy. The performance improvement plan was clearly designed to create grounds for termination. The reporting requirements alone would consume hours each week, making it difficult to focus on actual research. The weekly meetings with Stephen would provide regular opportunities for him to document any perceived shortcomings in my attitude or performance. Most importantly, the plan established a paper trail that would justify my eventual dismissal for performance-related reasons rather than retaliation for raising concerns about intellectual property theft. During the following weeks, I meticulously documented every aspect of the performance improvement plan and my interactions with company management. I recorded meetings when legally permissible, maintained detailed logs of assignments and deadlines, and carefully saved all email communications. I also began reaching out to former colleagues and industry contacts to understand my options if I decided to leave Castellan. What I discovered during those conversations was both encouraging and infuriating. My reputation in the research community remained strong, and several companies expressed interest in my background and expertise. More importantly, word of PC-47's promising results had spread through industry networks, and multiple firms were curious about the compound's development status and potential availability for partnership or licensing. When I explained that I was no longer leading the project, several contacts expressed surprise, as they'd heard presentations about the work that suggested I remained the primary investigator. The most revealing conversation was with Dr. Alan Sterling, a former colleague who now worked as a consultant for venture capital firms focused on biotechnology investments. When I mentioned PC-47 and my current situation at Castellan, Alan's response was immediate and concerned. Lois, there are rumors circulating that Castellan is shopping that compound to potential partners, and Richard Brennan has been representing himself as the lead inventor. If that's your work, you need to protect your intellectual property claims immediately. Alan's information prompted me to conduct my own investigation into how PC-47 was being represented in external discussions. Through industry contacts and careful research, I discovered that Richard Brennan had indeed presented at several business development conferences, describing PC-47 as a product of his team's research and outlining partnership opportunities for clinical development. In these presentations, my name was mentioned only briefly as someone who had contributed to preliminary target identification, while Richard claimed credit for the compound's design, optimization, and preclinical testing. This discovery motivated me to reach out to Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a former FDA researcher who now ran the oncology division at Meridian Therapeutics, my first employer. Elena had followed my career over the years and was familiar with my research approach and capabilities. When I explained my situation at Castellan, her response was swift and direct. Lois, if what you're describing is accurate, this is intellectual property theft, and you need to document everything before they file patent applications without proper attribution. Elena's comment prompted me to investigate Castellan's recent patent activity, and what I found was deeply troubling. 2 provisional patent applications had been filed for PC-47 and related compounds, listing Richard Brennan as the primary inventor and Stephen Webb as a contributing inventor. My name appeared only as a contributor to background research, despite the fact that I had conceived the initial target hypothesis, designed the lead compounds, and directed the optimization process that had produced PC-47. Armed with this information, I scheduled another meeting with Patricia Hoffman, my employment attorney. After reviewing the patent applications and my documentation of the intellectual property development process, Patricia's assessment was stark. They're stealing your work and preparing to cut you out entirely. The performance improvement plan is designed to justify your termination before you can take legal action. We need to act quickly to protect your rights. Patricia's advice was to formally challenge the patent applications while documenting the ongoing retaliation at Castellan. She explained that intellectual property disputes were most effectively resolved when the original inventor could demonstrate clear contribution to the claimed innovations, backed by contemporaneous records and witness testimony. She also recommended that I begin exploring exit strategies that would allow me to leave Castellan with my intellectual property claims intact and my professional reputation protected. The confrontation I'd been dreading came 6 weeks after the initial performance improvement plan meeting. Stephen scheduled what he described as a progress evaluation to discuss my performance under the improvement plan and determine next steps for my role at Castellan. The meeting was held in the company's largest conference room, with Stephen, Jennifer Walsh, Richard Brennan, and 2 other executives I didn't recognize in attendance. Stephen began by reviewing the performance improvement plan objectives and assessing my progress against the established metrics. According to his evaluation, I had failed to demonstrate adequate improvement in collaborative leadership and continued to show resistance to organizational changes. He cited specific examples of missed deadlines and incomplete reports, most of which were based on requirements that had never been clearly communicated or were impossible to fulfill, given my restricted access to resources and information. The most damaging assessment came from Richard Brennan, who reported that my knowledge transfer regarding PC-47 development had been incomplete and uncooperative. He claimed that critical information about compound synthesis and testing protocols had not been properly documented or shared, creating delays in his team's ability to advance the project. This accusation was particularly infuriating because I had spent weeks meticulously documenting every aspect of PC-47's development and had repeatedly offered to provide additional information or training to Richard's team. Jennifer Walsh then outlined Castellan's decision regarding my continued employment. The company was offering me 2 options: accept a voluntary resignation with a generous severance package that included 6 months of salary and benefits, or face termination for performance-related issues that would likely affect my ability to secure future employment in the biotechnology industry. The resignation option came with a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from discussing my research, my departure from Castellan, or any concerns about intellectual property or company practices. The severance offer also included a non-compete clause that would restrict my ability to work on cancer research targets related to my work at Castellan for a period of 2 years. When I pointed out that this would effectively prevent me from continuing my career in my area of expertise, Stephen responded that specialized knowledge developed at Castellan needed to be protected from competitive disclosure. The message was clear: accept their terms and abandon my career focus, or face termination and potential industry blacklisting. I requested time to consider the offer and consult with my attorney, which Stephen granted with obvious reluctance. As I left the conference room, I overheard Jennifer Walsh telling one of the unidentified executives that they needed to finalize the transition timeline and ensure that all intellectual property documentation was properly secured. The implication was that my decision about the severance offer would not change their plans for appropriating my research. It would only determine whether they faced legal challenges in the process. That evening, I called Patricia Hoffman and Dr. Martinez to discuss my options. Both advisors were unanimous in their recommendation. Fighting Castellan's intellectual property theft was essential, both for my own career and for the broader principle of protecting researchers' rights. Patricia explained that accepting the severance package would essentially validate Castellan's narrative and make it difficult to challenge their patent claims later. Martinez was even more direct. Lois, if you let them get away with this, it sets a precedent that companies can steal researchers' work without consequences. You have an obligation to fight back. But the decision was complicated by practical considerations. Fighting Castellan would be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially damaging to my reputation in the short term. The biotechnology industry was small, and companies were often reluctant to hire researchers involved in intellectual property disputes with former employers. There was also the risk that Castellan's superior resources and legal team could drag out any litigation until I was financially unable to continue. However, I had one advantage that Castellan's leadership didn't know about. During my investigation into industry interest in PC-47, I had been contacted by Dr. Rebecca Martinez's consulting firm about a potential opportunity with Nexus Biologics, a well-funded startup focused on developing novel cancer therapeutics. Elena Rodriguez had recommended me for a senior research position, and the company was specifically interested in my expertise with the target protein family that PC-47 was designed to inhibit. More importantly, Nexus Biologics was prepared to provide legal support for intellectual property claims related to my previous research, recognizing that protecting researchers' rights was essential for recruiting top talent. The company's CEO, Dr. James Wu, was a former academic researcher who had faced similar challenges with intellectual property recognition earlier in his career, and he was committed to ensuring that his company's scientists retained proper credit and rights for their discoveries. After extensive discussion with Patricia, Dr. Martinez, and the leadership team at Nexus Biologics, I made my decision. Rather than accepting Castellan's severance offer or waiting to be terminated, I would submit my resignation effective immediately and simultaneously file legal challenges to the PC-47 patent applications. Nexus Biologics would provide legal support for the intellectual property dispute and offer me a position as Director of Oncology Research, with the understanding that establishing proper attribution for my previous work was a priority. The confrontation I'd been preparing for came on a Thursday morning in early June. I scheduled a meeting with Stephen Webb to discuss my response to the severance offer, but instead of accepting or declining their terms, I presented him with my immediate resignation and formal notice of my intent to challenge Castellan's patent applications for PC-47 and related compounds. The meeting took place in Stephen's office, with Jennifer Walsh present to document the conversation. I had prepared extensively for this moment, reviewing my legal strategy with Patricia and practicing my key points to ensure I remained professional despite the anger I felt about how I'd been treated. When I announced my resignation, Stephen seemed relieved, probably assuming I was accepting defeat and leaving quietly. However, his demeanor changed dramatically when I explained that I was simultaneously filing challenges to the PC-47 patents based on my claim as the original inventor of the targeted compounds. I presented him with a detailed summary of my contributions to the research, including dates, experimental records, and witness statements from former team members who could attest to my leadership of the project. I also provided notice that I would be pursuing legal remedies for the intellectual property theft and the retaliatory treatment I'd experienced when I raised concerns about the misappropriation of my work. Stephen's response was immediate and hostile. He accused me of attempting to steal company intellectual property and threatened both criminal prosecution and civil litigation if I proceeded with my claims. He argued that all of my research at Castellan belonged to the company under my employment agreement, and that my challenges to the patent applications constituted an attempt to improperly claim credit for work funded by corporate resources. When I calmly explained that my employment agreement specified proper attribution for intellectual property developed by company researchers, and that the patent applications misrepresented my contributions in violation of federal patent law, Stephen became increasingly agitated. He threatened to destroy my reputation in the industry and ensure that I would never work in biotechnology again if I pursued legal action against Castellan. The conversation escalated when Jennifer Walsh attempted to intervene by suggesting that my concerns could be addressed through internal discussions rather than legal action. She offered to review the patent applications and consider appropriate attribution adjustments if I would withdraw my legal challenges and sign a modified non-disclosure agreement. This offer confirmed what I had suspected. Castellan knew their patent applications were problematic, and they were scrambling to avoid a formal legal challenge that would expose their inappropriate behavior. My response was firm and unambiguous. I would not negotiate away my intellectual property rights or accept modified attribution that minimized my central role in developing PC-47. The research was mine, the compound was my invention, and I would pursue every available legal remedy to ensure proper recognition and protection of my work. I also made it clear that I had documented the retaliation I'd experienced and would include those claims in any legal action against the company. The meeting ended with Stephen issuing explicit threats about the consequences of challenging Castellan's intellectual property claims. He warned that the company would aggressively defend its rights and would pursue all available remedies against anyone attempting to steal company property. He also suggested that my future employment prospects would be severely damaged by my decision to turn against the company that had invested in my career development. As I left Stephen's office for the final time, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. I had finally taken the stand I should have taken months earlier, but I also understood that I was beginning a battle that could define the rest of my career. Castellan had significant resources and a strong incentive to fight aggressively, but I had the truth, comprehensive documentation, and legal representation that gave me confidence in my position. The immediate aftermath of my resignation and legal challenge was swift and decisive. Within hours of my meeting with Stephen, I received a call from Patricia Hoffman informing me that Castellan's legal team had contacted her office threatening immediate litigation if I didn't withdraw my patent challenges. The company was claiming that my resignation constituted breach of contract and that my intellectual property claims were frivolous attempts to damage Castellan's business relationships. More concerning, word of my dispute with Castellan began spreading through industry networks within days of my resignation. Several contacts reached out to express support, but others seemed to distance themselves from what they perceived as a messy legal battle that could affect their own business relationships. The biotechnology industry's tight-knit nature meant that taking on a well-established company like Castellan carried risks beyond the immediate legal challenges. However, my decision to join Nexus Biologics provided immediate validation for my position. When the startup announced my hiring as Director of Oncology Research, the press release specifically mentioned my groundbreaking research in targeted cancer therapeutics and the company's commitment to supporting researchers' intellectual property rights. Dr. James Wu, Nexus's CEO, made it clear that the company stood behind my patent challenges and would provide full legal support for establishing proper attribution of my previous work. The legal battle that followed was exactly as challenging as Patricia had predicted. Castellan's strategy was to overwhelm my legal resources through aggressive litigation tactics while simultaneously attempting to damage my reputation through industry contacts. They filed countersuits alleging breach of contract, theft of trade secrets, and interference with business relationships. They also began reaching out to my professional contacts, suggesting that my claims were motivated by sour grapes about normal corporate restructuring rather than legitimate intellectual property concerns.
Ew. Ew.
That Castellan had made a critical error in their handling of the PC-47 patents. During the discovery process, Patricia's investigation revealed that the company had filed patent applications that not only minimized my contributions, but also contained inaccuracies about the compound's development timeline and methodology. More damaging, internal emails obtained through litigation showed that Stephen and Richard had discussed strategies for minimizing Lois's attribution and ensuring that the patents reflected current team leadership rather than historical contributions. The smoking gun came in the form of an email exchange between Stephen and James Morrison, the Chief Business Development Officer, discussing plans to license PC-47 to pharmaceutical partners. In these emails, Stephen explicitly acknowledged that I was the primary inventor of the compound, but argued that business considerations required repositioning the intellectual property to reflect current organizational structure. This direct admission of intentional misattribution provided exactly the evidence Patricia needed to demonstrate that Castellan had knowingly filed false patent applications. The revelation of these emails prompted settlement discussions that I had never expected. Faced with clear evidence of intellectual property theft and false patent filings, Castellan's legal team approached Patricia about resolving the dispute without admitting wrongdoing. The proposed settlement included corrected patent applications with proper attribution, financial compensation for the intellectual property theft, and agreements that would allow me to continue research in my area of expertise without restriction. More importantly, the settlement required Castellan to publicly acknowledge my role as the primary inventor of PC-47 and related compounds. This acknowledgement would be included in all future business development discussions, partnership negotiations, and licensing agreements related to the technology. For me, this recognition was more valuable than any financial settlement, as it restored my professional reputation and ensured that my most important research achievement would be properly attributed. The settlement negotiations took 3 months to complete, during which I focused on establishing myself at Nexus Biologics and beginning new research projects. The company had provided me with an exceptional team and resources to pursue next-generation cancer targets, building on the foundation I'd established with PC-47 but exploring novel approaches that could lead to even more effective treatments. Working in an environment that valued intellectual integrity and researcher recognition was transformative after the toxic culture I'd experienced at Castellan. 6 months after leaving Castellan, the settlement was finalized with terms that exceeded my initial expectations. The financial compensation was substantial, but more importantly, the agreement established a clear precedent for protecting researchers' intellectual property rights in corporate environments. Castellan was required to implement new policies for patent attribution and researcher recognition, and they faced ongoing monitoring to ensure compliance with intellectual property laws. The resolution of my legal battle with Castellan had immediate effects on my career and reputation. Industry recognition of my role as PC-47's inventor led to speaking invitations at major conferences, editorial board appointments at leading journals, and consulting opportunities with biotechnology companies seeking expertise in targeted cancer therapeutics. More gratifying, Several former colleagues reached out to thank me for taking a stand that established important precedents for protecting researchers' rights. At Nexus Biologics, my research program flourished in ways that would have been impossible in Castellan's toxic environment. Within 6 months, my team had identified three promising new targets for cancer therapy, secured significant grant funding from the National Cancer Institute, and established collaborations with leading academic medical centers. The company's commitment to intellectual integrity created an environment where innovative research could thrive without the constant concern about credit theft or political manipulation. The impact of my experience extended beyond my individual career to broader conversations about researcher rights and corporate responsibility in the biotechnology industry. Professional organizations began developing new guidelines for intellectual property attribution, and several companies implemented policies designed to prevent the kind of systematic research theft I had experienced at Castellan. My case became a reference point for other researchers facing similar challenges, and I began serving as an advisor for legal cases involving intellectual property disputes. Perhaps most importantly, PC47 continued its development toward clinical trials under proper attribution and with appropriate recognition of my foundational contributions. The compound that had started as a theoretical concept in my laboratory was moving closer to potentially helping cancer patients, and I would be recognized as its inventor regardless of the corporate politics that had initially threatened to erase my contribution. The personal cost of fighting for my intellectual property rights had been significant, but the professional vindication was complete. I had proven that researchers could successfully challenge corporate theft of their work, and I had established myself as a leader not only in cancer research but also in advocating for the rights and recognition that scientists deserve for their contributions to medical advancement. Looking back on this experience now, I realize how important it was that I documented everything and built relationships with people who could support me when corporate politics threatened to destroy my career. The biotechnology industry is built on innovation and discovery, but those innovations are only valuable when the people who create them are properly recognized and protected. My advice to any researcher facing similar challenges is straightforward. Document everything, build strong professional relationships, and never accept that intellectual property theft is just part of corporate culture. Your research matters, your contributions deserve recognition, and there are legal remedies available when companies try to steal your life's work. The fight isn't easy, but your career and the broader research community depend on people being willing to stand up for what's right. If you've experienced workplace injustice or had your work stolen by supervisors or colleagues, I want you to know that you're not alone and that fighting back is possible. The system isn't always fair, but there are ways to protect yourself and ensure that your contributions receive proper recognition. Please share your own experiences in the comments below and subscribe to join a community of professionals who believe that integrity and recognition matter in building careers that make a real difference. What happened to me at Castellan was wrong, but it led to better opportunities, stronger legal protections for researchers, and the satisfaction of knowing that my work will be properly attributed as it helps develop treatments that could save lives. Your career belongs to you. Your research contributions deserve recognition, and you have the right to fight for both when companies try to take them away.